When I was in grade school, we had music appreciation class. And as its name would suggest, the coursework was designed to encourage us to appreciate music. And we learned about music history and theory and about how so much of what we enjoy today is due in large part to the contribution of great composers from 200 plus years ago. And I always like to think of this Sunday every year as American appreciation. Besides enjoying both a lovely outdoor worship experience followed by a picnic lunch, the greater tradition of our annual 4th of July weekend service in the park is to gather and appreciate this magnificent country that we're blessed to call home. Over the past few years, I've tried to follow my grade school model, encouraging appreciation by talking about history and theory, and about how so much of what we enjoy today is due in large part to the contributions of great individuals from 200 plus years ago. Now, America is unique and exceptional because it is more than a place. It is a purpose. We were founded on the truth that humans cannot reach their potential or realize their dreams unless they're free. We are a cause that took on the physical form of a country. The idea that colonies would seek independence from their mother country was almost incomprehensible at that time. John Adams described our revolution as being, quote, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations. And he was absolutely right. The American Revolution was almost snuffed out as quickly as it began. Without General Washington's surprise victory at the Battle of Trenton the day after Christmas 1776, America would have dissolved less than 6 months after being created. It took a few miracles for the eagle to break out of her shell, and it would take another miracle or two before the eagle was able to spread her wings and fly. And that leads us to today's story. Now, if you assumed that America winning the Revolutionary War in 1783 meant that we were now secure as a nation well on its way to becoming a global leader, you assumed wrong. 30 years later, a series of events would unfold that were going to challenge the strength, resolve, and legitimacy of our new nation. Now, to understand history, it's important to look at the big picture of what's going on, particularly examining the mindset of some of the key players involved. So to give you a relatable idea of what's going on in 19th century France, I'm going to tell a quick personal story. Now, around mid-April every year, my wife and I like to stock up on summer supplies for our house. Things like charcoal and lighter fluid for the grill, extra line for the edger, and weed killer for the lawn. And we hit up our usual destinations, places like Lowe's, Ace, Rural King, and Tractor Supply. Now, anytime I go into one of these stores, I can't help but stop and stare at the aisle with all of the axes and machetes. Now, mind you, we already own an axe, but it's not the big jumbo-sized one. You can probably guess where this is going. So every year I beg Laura, sweetheart, can I please buy this enormous axe? And she'll say, Jay, we have a perfectly fine axe at home already. Why do you need this big jumbo-sized one for? Well, the truth is, I don't need the jumbo-sized axe. I just want the jumbo-sized axe. Because to me, it represents a feeling of toughness and masculinity. I picture it, sitting in my shed, and I just hear the Tim Allen grunt, oh, 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 oh. And this is where the big historical picture comes into play. Because in 1812, France is ruled by an emperor named Napoleon. And the difference between me and Napoleon is that when I want to feel manly and tough, I go to a place like Rural King and I say, I want to buy and have this jumbo-sized axe. And my wife politely tells me no. When Napoleon wants to feel manly and tough, he goes to a place like Portugal and says, I want to own Portugal. and Mrs. Napoleon doesn't have a say in the matter. Well, you can see how this might get out of hand rather quickly. Well, with Napoleon's conquest of Europe in full swing, he finds himself at war with Great Britain. And in an effort to gain a strategic advantage over Napoleon, the British start blockading American trade ships that are crossing the Atlantic, exchanging goods with France. Well, the U.S. now faces a real problem because American families and businesses rely on access to those French markets. Thus, the War of 1812 begins. Now, raise your hand if you've ever had something that seemed firmly in your grasp, but then it somehow slipped through your fingers. We all know that terrible feeling. Maybe it's the loss of a job, or the loss of a relationship, or perhaps the loss of a bid to go to the Final Four for the first time since 1980. That's how the British felt after the American colonies gained independence. What they once held control of was gone. It slipped right through their fingers. However, by August 1814, it looked like they might be able to take America back under British rule. The British had conquered Washington, D.C. They burned the White House, the Capitol building, and several other government facilities. And after toppling Washington, D.C., they headed north to Baltimore. Now, at that time, Baltimore was the third largest city in America, and the Chesapeake Bay was a major hub for merchant ships doing business across the Atlantic. And the British knew that if they could sack Baltimore, America would essentially be cut in half, and our collapse would be imminent. Now, earlier I mentioned that understanding history involves looking at the big picture. And I brought up the story about Napoleon because as long as he was pillaging through Europe, the British had to be engaged in two separate theaters. So they couldn't allocate 100% of their resources to either front. Well, just our luck, Napoleon's forces are largely defeated in 1814. So what does that mean? Well, as Washington, D.C. is smoldering, the rest of the British war fleet is sailing across the Atlantic, heading straight for Baltimore. Well, it's about that time that we meet a young man named Francis Scott Key. Francis was a lawyer in Baltimore, but we remember him in history because of a famous poem he wrote. A poem which tells a story that is as suspenseful as it is inspiring. Now, by this point in the conflict, both sides have accumulated several prisoners of war. And the British were holding our American POWs in a ship about 1,000 yards offshore in Baltimore Harbor. Well, the United States appointed Francis Scott Key to try to negotiate a mutual exchange of prisoners. So he sails out on a rowboat to speak with the British officials, and they reached an agreement that prisoners could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Well, Francis Scott Key was pretty excited about the successful deal he had just negotiated, so he decided to go down below deck and share the news with the American POWs. He said, "Men, I have wonderful news for you tonight. You are going to be set free." So as Francis headed back up to the deck to work out the final details of the exchange, the British admiral approaches him and said, "We have a slight problem. We'll still honor our commitment to exchange these prisoners, but it's going to be a moot point here in a few hours." A bit puzzled, Francis looked at the admiral and said, "What do you mean?" Well, the admiral replied, "Mr. Key, tonight we have laid out an ultimatum. You see that fort over there, Fort McHenry? Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or we're going to remove Fort McHenry from the face of the earth." Well, Francis Scott Key says, "Well, how do you plan to do that?" The admiral replied, Look out over the Chesapeake Bay. You see all those little dots? That's the entire British war fleet. We're going to use all of the gunpowder and armament to demolish that fort. Our fleet will be within striking distance very soon. The war will be over, so these prisoners would go free anyway. Well, Francis Scott Key said, what about all the women and children in that fort? The admiral said, don't worry, we've left them a way out. Francis said, oh yeah? What's that? The admiral said, you see that flag way up on the rampart? Well, we told them that if they will lower that flag, we'll know that they've surrendered. The shelling will stop immediately, and you'll now be under British rule. Well, Francis Scott Key informed the American POWs of what was about to happen. And as the fleet got closer, he said, I'll shout down to you what's going on as we watch. Well, as the ships began to fill up Baltimore Harbor, I have a feeling that the American soldiers inside Fort McHenry were praying words fairly similar to the beginning of Psalm 144, which says, Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight. My goodness and my fortress, my high tower and my deliverer, my shield and he in whom I trust. Well, in the wee hours of the morning on September 13th, the British war fleet unleashed. The darkness of the sky was suddenly lit up. The sound was deafening. But besides the roar of the cannons, all Francis Scott Key could hear was the prisoners down below shouting, Tell us where the flag is. What have they done with the flag? Please tell us the flag is still flying over the rampart. Well, every time a bomb would explode in that general area, the illumination from the red glare would make the flag visible up on the rampart. So Francis Scott Key would shout down, It's still up. The flag is not down. Well, the admiral walks up and says, Your people are absolutely insane. Do they not understand that this is an impossible situation? Well, Francis Scott Key remembered a quote from George Washington saying, The thing that sets the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is that he will die on his feet before he will live on his knees. The admiral told Francis, We have now instructed all of our cannons to focus on the rampart to take that flag down. Now, our reconnaissance tells us that the flag has taken direct hits over and over and over again, but yet it's still flying. Well, we don't really understand that, but nevertheless, we're about to aim every cannon at that flag for the next 3 hours. Well, the ensuing barrage was unmerciful. But again, besides the cannon fire, all Francis Scott Key could hear was the men below praying, God, keep that flag flying where we last saw it. Well, in total, the British shelled Fort McHenry nonstop for 27 hours. Finally, sunrise came on the morning of September 14th. And there was a heavy mist in the air, but the rampart was tall enough that from out in the harbor, the men on the ships could look up and see our flag was still there. Well, realizing that their efforts to destroy the fort had been in vain, the British released Francis Scott Key and then sailed away. Well, when he arrived back on shore, Francis made his way up to the rampart, and he saw that the flagpole was standing at a somewhat distorted angle. And he approaches, and he finds out that during the course of the attack, as the pole was taking direct hits, the men in the fort knew what it meant if a flag came down. Well, what Francis Scott Key learned was that each time that it would begin to slip, men in the fort, knowing full well that the British cannons were aimed right at them, would walk up and hold the flag manually until they died. And as each man died, his body was removed and another man would take his place. Inspired by what he had seen and heard, Francis Scott Key wrote a poem that went on to become very famous. And when you hear the words of this poem today and in the future, I hope you'll think back and remember that Old Glory doesn't fly because of the blowing of the wind. She flies with the last breath of the brave men who sacrificed their lives holding her up in order to keep America free. The poem starts out, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" Amen.